Since he was a young boy, Mosab Hassan Yousef has had an inside view of the deadly terrorist group Hamas. The oldest son and the heir apparent of Sheikh Hassan Yousef, a founding member of Hamas and its most popular leader. Young Mosab assisted his father for years in his political activities whilst being groomed to follow in his footsteps. But everything changed when Mosab embraced the teachings of another famous Middle East leader instead. What he learned changed his life and could alter the course of the country's future forever. In Son of Hamas, Mosab reveals new information about the world's most dangerous terrorist organisation and unveils the truth about his own secret role, his agonising separation from family and homeland, his dangerous choices and his belief that the mandate to love your enemies is the only way to peace in the Middle East. Hello YouTube, this is Sadako24 here, and what I just read is the back blurb of the autobiography of Mosab Hassan Yousef, son of Hamas. Now, I've done several videos on the Israel-Gaza conflict, and something of my personal moral journey of learning from this conflict. Now, you might have noticed in quite a few of my videos on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and particularly the current Israel-Gaza war, I have quite often, cited him as a source. I've used clips of him, giving his take on the situation with Hamas in Gaza. And I figured it was probably time I did a video that was kind of very focused on him, because I feel like in some ways his kind of moral worldview on this kind of probably aligns most closely with my own in some ways. As the book describes, Mosab Hassan Yousef was born in the West Bank in the late 70s. He came of age in the 90s, at a time when the West Bank was still under, was and remains under the occupation of the IDF. As a young radical, he was very angry about that, and he was born into a family that was committed to the Hamas cause. Various events happened that led him to become disillusioned in Hamas and realise that they were not the freedom fighters he thought they were, and so he ended up working with the Israelis to thwart Hamas. And as you've seen in my videos, since October the 7th, he's been far more angry and vocal about just how horrific Hamas are, And I decided I'm going to do a two-part video on him, to kind of show his worldview and how he kind of got to the position he is. And I figured it was probably a good way of covering the conflict through his eyes, and how this conflict shapes people, shall we say. Now, first of all, I'm going to look at a fairly older debate he had on the Piers Morgan show, Piers Morgan Uncensored, in which he had a debate with a Egyptian activist and podcaster called Ramazan, a very kind of passionate Palestinian activist, activist for the Palestinian movement.
And we stand with the Palestinians, and we stand with Arabs, and they try and change the narrative because you own the narrative. See, this is our problem. You own the narrative. You own the United Nations. You own Hollywood. You own all these mouthpieces. Where are our voices? Our voices need to be heard as well. We've been watching your channels, and instead of mourning our dead, instead of mourning these Palestinian children, we've been having to deal with more dehumanization of Arabs. We ask you to condemn. Where are your condemnations? Where's your channel covering this? Cover this. Say the truth. We understand you're an employee. You're just a puppet. You're just a mouthpiece. Come talk to me like a human being. Come talk to me like a human being. Thank you. I understand you have your foreign policy. No, I've heard you. I've heard you. You hear me. I understand you have your foreign policy. I understand you speak for your government. I understand you represent your government. But that being said, you're a country that's claimed free speech. Your customized democracy is actually what led to Hamas. And now we are watching an occupation, and we are watching the result of your silence of your misrepresentation of Arabs. If you heard me, if you really heard me, you would quit your channel. Just like your ambassador, I don't know who did. Some humanity. The US gave the okay for Israel. Carte blanche to kill all those Palestinians. This massacre, we were sleeping here today. We listened to the bombs. I, in my grown age, was scared. Imagine children, imagine babies. Will you even air it? Will you edit it? Okay, fine. You get your time. 1 second. Play. Oh, right. My microphone on. You speak Arabic? Only a little bit. I'm just gonna. First of all, tell me your name. My name is Rahma Zina. I am an Egyptian. Okay. Rahma. Tell me why you're here today. I am here today because of a multitude of things. First, the unfair occupation that's lasted for 70 plus years, and the fact that Gaza has been dubbed an open-air prison with Palestinians, no access to water, no access to be able to move in or out, not able to maneuver. We have family here, Palestinian family, who have their Palestinian families there. They're not even able, the ease of maneuvering. You go to holidays, it's easy for you. It's not that easy for them. Life is so difficult. It's against human rights. Israel has breached human rights time and time again, and it seems that it is above of international law.
I will say this for Ramazan. She clearly cares about the Palestinian people far more than her bloody government does. You know, her government was happy to, much like Hamas, use the Palestinians as human shields. The reason why, so many civilians are trapped in the Gaza Strip is because Egypt sealed its border, refused to let a single Palestinian in. Well, it officially refused to let a single Palestinian refugee in. You have to be very, very rich in order to bribe your way out into Egypt from Gaza.
The onset of a renewed war between Israel and Hamas has led to fears that millions of Palestinian people living in the Gaza Strip may be forced to become refugees. But despite the fact that Gaza shares a border with Egypt, the Egyptian government almost immediately ruled out any possibility of accepting Palestinian refugees. In fact, Egypt is currently constructing an even larger border wall with Gaza than the one it currently has in place. Now, many outside observers have asked why Egypt, a majority Arab and Islamic nation, would turn away the Palestinian people. And of course, many have pointed out that it may serve the political interests of many Arab nations to refuse to accept Palestinian refugees because it allows them to then blame Israel for any sort of humanitarian crisis that unfolds.
They've done this, it seems, out of a very cynical agenda to make things very, very hard for Israel and to force Israel into a position where if it conducts its offensive, it can be charged with genocide. Frankly, very, very nasty, very petty game that the Egyptian government is playing here.
This week the focus should be on Rafah, the southern Gazan city where more than 1 million people have sought refuge from the Israeli assault on the rest of the Strip. Israel is poised to invade it. Its critics believe civilians will be sitting ducks with nowhere else to go. Mass casualties will be inevitable.
Of course, now at the time of this interview took place, this was when Israel was about to go into Rafah. Biden was being a stick in the mud and putting a blocking weapons shipments because he was trying his best to stop Israel going into Rafah.
I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. We're going to continue to make sure Israel is secure in terms of Iron Dome and their ability to respond to attacks like came out of the Middle East recently. But it's just wrong. We're not going to supply the weapons and the artillery shells used that have been used.
Artillery shells as well.
Yeah, artillery shells.
Which, frankly, is the most disgusting thing I've ever known Biden do. The Biden administration is rotten and corrupt. It seemingly is very two-faced, and it's very criminal, and it's and corrupt, and it's had an agenda to keep Iran sweet. It's been very kind of, two-faced in this. It's trying to keep Iran sweet at the same time. It's supposedly, expressing support for Israel. But particularly, Biden was trying to stop Israel going into Rafah. And he kept on sabotaging weapon shipments, which Israel needed to get the job done.
So, just to understand what they're doing right now in Rafah, is that not going into Rafah as you defined
yet? They haven't gone into the population centers. What they did is right on the border, and it's causing problems with right now in terms of with Egypt, which I've worked very hard to make sure we have a relationship and help. But I've made it clear to Bibi and the War Cabinet, they're not going to get our support if, in fact, they go in these population centers.
It's the shadiest conduct I've ever seen an American administration conduct. And you might think, well, isn't it noble to stop weapon shipments? But the thing is, he was blocking the shipment of precision weapons, whilst Israel was already engaged in the conflict. So all you're doing by blocking precision weapons is hampering Israel's precision, which basically is going to mean that the war operation is more likely to kill indiscriminate, is more likely to cause collateral damage. Yes, it didn't seem done for any humanitarian interests or compassion for the Palestinian people, or for innocent collateral. It was just sabotage, and it was done publicly.
And I want to speak to Joe Biden directly. Who the hell do you think you are? Who the hell do you think you are to use these blood libels against the Jewish people, that they are indiscriminately murdering Palestinian civilians, when you spew the lies of the Hamas terrorists against the Jews and unleash anti-Semitism in this country around the world like we've never seen before? Who the hell do you think you are to tell a democracy, the Jewish people that elected this government, that you don't like their government, that you don't like their prime minister, that they need to remove him and place him with some clown or lapdog that you prefer? Who the hell do you think you are to tell the Israelis that they cannot defeat Hamas, which has proven again and again that they want to wipe out the Jewish population in Israel? Who the hell do you think you are to be funding Iran and Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah, arming them with our money, with money from oil sales? Who the hell do you think you are? You say you provide weapons to Israel. You haven't provided a damn thing to Israel. Congress provides weapons to Israel. You're the one violating the Impoundment Act and the Constitution by withholding it. Who the hell do you think you are, dictating to the Jewish people who survived the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, and the Third Reich, telling them that they cannot wipe out Hamas, which is committed to the evisceration of their population? Who the hell do you think you are to exploit the Jews here at home by going to sacred property, the Holocaust Museum and Memorial, as a political stunt, while secretly behind the back of the Jewish state, you're cutting off arms? Who the hell do you think you are when your party, your Democrat donors whip up anti-Semitism all across this country, and you don't tell them to stop, and you don't send the U.S. Marshals in there so the Jewish kids can go to school, and you don't direct the FBI to cut off this foreign funding from Qatar, your buddies at Qatar, your brother's buddies at Qatar? Who the hell do you think you are to tell the Jewish people in Israel whether they get to live or whether they get to die?
An alliance between Israel and America is only as ironclad as it's perceived to be. And that, the strength of, the West is the view of the West as invincible. And the perception that, that the West is a great protector of its allies, which is supposed to act as the perfect deterrent to the West's enemies to try their luck with the West allies. Biden, by doing that, has broken that. He is breaking that. He is basically sending a message to Iran that the Israel-American, the US-Israel alliance is weak. It's not ironclad. There's a weakness there. It's breaking apart. America is not a reliable ally. It's not a strong ally. It's not a committed ally. And so Iran can kind of get away with... Iran is sending the message to Iran that it can get away with going on the offensive, to an insane degree.
Right now, you're saying on the one hand, it's Iran, Russia, and sort of China, and now you're saying Iran is completely isolated and afraid. Which one is it? Let's be real here. This is not about geopolitics. That is always a part of everything. But this is about a moral issue. But you cannot comprehend that your governments are morally inferior than others. Your governments are terror states.
And to me, that's unforgivable. And it's not just, that it's signalling weakness and, signalling an invitation to go on the attack on Israel. It's also sending a message to America's allies in general that, America is not a reliable ally. And it's not a strong ally. So it's jeopardizing, the Western alliances in general. And it's basically jeopardizing whatever security and stability, global security and stability even exists in this chaotic world, and particularly this chaotic, volatile region, the Middle East. And for that, Biden cannot be forgiven. And the worst thing is, because this is all about perception, and that, it's like the magic trick has been broken. It's been exposed. I don't know even if Trump gets in November, and I pray to God he does. I pray to God by the time this video comes out, I pray to God that he does. I don't know even if Trump can reverse the damage. I mean, this has caused me more sleepless nights in this war than anything else.
Well, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says the US is the only country in the world that can stop Israel from attacking Rafah. And President Biden has told Israel to go no further. But can he really stop them? And should there be consequences if Israel does ignore the US and presses on with an invasion, despite its most important ally not offering support?
But anyway, it's once Israel actually went into Rafah, they discovered the real reason why the US was trying to hold them back, and why Egypt has refused to let the refugees, has refused to facilitate the refugee flow of Palestinians out of Gaza. Turns out that there is a Philadelphia corridor. There's a tunnel connecting Gaza to Egypt, through which Hamas was getting its supplies and its weapons. Something that, at best, the government of Egypt was prepared to turn a blind eye to. This was probably a black market. Border guards having this black market of smuggling with, a smuggling deal with Hamas. But what's disturbing is the fact that Egypt was willing to use the Palestinians as human shields to hamper Israel's effort to discover this, and B, that the left don't care. The left wing still have made this all about Israel being the sinner here. Egypt has done this knowing that it will evade any condemnations, because all the condemnations will be directed at Israel.
Well, to debate this, I'm joined by the Egyptian podcaster Rama Zain and by the son of Hamas's founder and former Palestinian militant Mosab Hassan Yousef. Well, welcome to both of you, both returning to Uncensored. Let me ask you first of all, if I may, Rama Zain, since we last spoke several months ago about all this war has continued to rage, and tens of thousands of people have died in Gaza. And it's quite likely, if there is a full-scale invasion of Rafah, that tens of thousands of more civilians may die in the process of Israel, as they put it, getting rid of Hamas in its entirety. What is your view of where this war now is?
It's sad to see that a few months after, we're regurgitating and having to repeat the same things that we've warned about since day one. that things are getting out of hand, that at one point do you start calling someone who keeps inciting these war crimes a criminal? So not having held them accountable from day one has led to the audacity and the confidence that we are witnessing in the crimes. And just as you had stated, now that there might be further violence onto Rafah, you don't know if the US is even able to stop them. And we mention Gaza, but we don't even mention the West Bank. We don't mention what's happening in other places. And again, this allowing them to continue with their blatant war crimes that, by the way, their soldiers are filming and sending them to one another on Telegram channels and other social media channels, just goes to show to what extent they are confident to continue as such. And it's scary. We've seen news that probably the ICC is going to be calling Netanyahu in as a criminal and for trial, and the US is aiming to stop that. At one point, you have to take a stand that enough is enough. It is sad that we are repeating what we had been saying from day one.
Okay, let me bring in Mosab.
As you might have gathered, I am against this ICC attempt to prosecute Netanyahu, for the very simple reason that I think if the International Criminal Court makes it the precedent that you can now be punished for fighting against a terrorist group like Hamas, then you're basically awarding a moral victory to Hamas and terrorists like them. And basically you are, international law is now dictating that you have to submit to genocidal terrorists trying to kill your people now. You can't fight back against them. The precedent is set that it's illegal to fight back. You have to submit and take it. And, in the name of cosmic justice, I think that's just utterly intolerable.
Okay, let me bring in Mosab Hassan Yousef for your response to that. I should point out that the ICC is not just threatening, apparently, to bring in Israeli leaders, but also Hamas leaders. Mosab Hassan Yousef, you said, I think, in the Times of Israel last week, we need to go into Rafah now, not tomorrow. What are we waiting for? We finish Rafah, we finish Hamas. This will remove them from power, which will be the first step towards peace. Of course, the contrary view to this is that if Israel does go hard into Rafah to try and eliminate Hamas completely and kills potentially tens of thousands more civilians, that the global support for Israel will completely evaporate. And many people will view what is happening there as a war crime. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I don't think Israel should compromise its security because of global pressure, because this global pressure sooner or later is going to go away. Now, people are traumatized by the tragedy of Gaza, and many people are making irrational decisions. In my opinion, if we don't end Hamas and remove them from power, like at least to remove them from power, we are going to have many other wars. This is not Hamas' first attempt to take hostages and to take civilians as human shields. They've done this many times already. And I don't think that we need to give Hamas one more opportunity to destabilize the region and create a major war like this.
Yeah, I was freaking out actually at the time, and there was something kind of reassuring about Mosab saying, "You've got nothing to lose, go in, get it done." Because I was worrying that on top of, the existential threat posed to Israel by Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran, that there was now an existential threat to it by the international community who wanted to restrain Israel's hand whilst it's defending itself from an existential threat, and wanting to ruin its economy, ruin everything that basically ensures its protection and ensures that it is a step above the region, or render it defenseless in the face of existential threats. Mosab was right to say, you got nothing to lose, but that's the problem really, that all of the efforts to kind of, try to render Israel defenseless in this situation, because it's this existential. All it's doing is convincing Israel that it's got nothing to lose and the time is running out and it has to rush the job, which really is only going to make the civilian collateral potentially worse. And it just seems insane that the left are willing to risk that, and that the United Nations are willing to risk that. And I never had any idea that the UN and the left, the modern left, were that petty. Which more fooled me, because it should have been obvious, that the left is especially petty and the UN is especially petty. The UN is, it makes sense. It's a racket of vindictive dictatorships. Of course it's petty. Of course it's going to be more interested in pursuing vendettas than justice through lawfare, using lawfare to pursue vendettas rather than justice. That's why the UN is such a rotten body. And it's like, do you really want Israel to be fighting this like it's got nothing to lose? That is utterly insane. And it's not just twisted, there's serious consequences to that, which it's the most disturbing side of the left I've ever seen.
But is there not a danger, Mosab, that by doing this the way Israel is doing it, by flattening most of Gaza in the process, by killing so many civilians, including women and so many children, because of the age demographic of Gaza, with half the people there being children, is there not a danger that by trying to do what you've just said, in trying to get rid of Hamas, which many people, I'm sure, in Israel would love to do, and I understand completely why they have a desire for that to happen, that by doing it, you actually end up achieving the opposite of making Israel more secure, that you create a whole new generation of people radicalized by losing their children, their mothers, their wives, and so on. And they become even more determined to exact revenge.
Yes, well, Israel is fighting for its very existence. And I am also fighting for my very existence. When there are people out there who want you to cease to exist, this is when they push you to the corner and you have no other choice but to fight. I'm in the same position. How it feels like when you have hundreds of millions of people who sentenced you to death because of false narratives. And this is why we have this trouble in the United States and a global chaos. Because people are in denial of the truth that Israel is not targeting civilians on a purpose. They are not killing in Gaza for sport. This is what Hamas did on October 7. It was an actual genocide that the world doesn't want to admit. Now, even though the ICJ judges, they say it was not a genocide. What's happening in Gaza is not a genocide. This is what the judge say. But then we have all the wannabes and the social media warriors and the low-grade journalists still in public that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. And we simply say it's collateral damage. Two different things.
Okay. Ramazan.
Right. His point about, he's fighting for his very existence. What he's talking about, of course, is the fact that as a result of betraying Hamas and betraying his family lineage, as it were, his family legacy, there is now a fatwa on him. There's been a fatwa on him for decades, well, since the mid-2000s. There's a fatwa on him for his involvement with the Israeli Secret Service. And that basically means that he is, like, he left the West Bank and moved to America before the expose happened. Kind of finally confessed to his father, be it through letters, and he was disowned by his father, and it was clear there was going to be a fatwa on him. And he has said, that he thinks he probably never will be, that it's unlikely he'll ever be able to return home to the West Bank. And so there's a lot of kind of that in some ways influences Mosab's worldview, because he was born in 1978, long after the Nakba happened, the expulsion of the Palestinians from the the territory that is now Israel. But the thing is, so to him, his personal Nakba actually is not at the hands of Israel. The reason he has been driven from home and he has no right to return, and the reason he's had to leave everything behind, and the reason he's been exiled from the West Bank, as it were, it's kind of like it's his personal Nakba, but it's not Israel that exiled him, it's his own people. It's the Palestinians who exiled him and marked him for death, as it were. So he's had to learn to accept that he'll never be able to go home, probably. Which is ironic, really, because of this longing to return home from exile is what has driven so much of seems to have driven so much of the conflict as a whole. Seems to have driven the Palestinian cause. But it kind of gives you some idea of why Mosab's perspective is so different to most Palestinians, why he kind of, once you go against the fold, more and more you kind of pushed against the fold.
Mr. Hassan, I truly do apologize that your type of relationship with your father has led you to this quest to condone the annihilation of your own people. I truly am sorry for that. But just as you said, it is not about you. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today and how we're seeing it, it is bigger and it is older than Hamas. When you look at the Palestinians, predominantly, for example, yesterday there was one protest with predominantly Christian Palestinians. It is much more than what we are seeing today. The right of return, the fact that, it was actually quite interesting. You have some Zionists here telling the pro-Palestinian protesters, go back home. And their response is, we want to. So come join our protest so that we can have the right to return, end the siege. Whatever you do, and you just said, you have, at one point you get so oppressed, you have to fight back. You just said that. So what ends up happening, and you have to understand that, as everyone, and Pierce, on your show, so many people have said the same thing. You are going to keep having more resistance as long as you don't do something about it. And you keep speaking about the hostages. What about those that are being abducted from the West Bank? What about those that are in prison? What about the children that are in prisons? At some point, you have to stand up and say that this cycle has to end. And how does it end? By changing your tactic, by putting those that are the perpetrators accountable. And you, sir, are stating that it is not a genocide. It is, even the intent for genocide would label it as a genocide, which we have seen from occupation leaders calling them subhuman, Ben Gavir asking for a nuclear bomb to be dropped at them. And I wish to reiterate, I understand that you have had your personal issues, but like you said, it's not about you. It's a collective movement to end the cycle of violence.
One of the reasons I find it so hard to take this genocide charge at all seriously is that the fact that Hamas had to do something this savage and evil and horrific on October the 7th to provoke Israel into what people keep calling a genocidal mania. If that's what it has to take to draw out the genocidal nature of Israel, of the Israeli regime, if that's what it takes, then it tells me that the Israelis can't be all that genocidal then. If you have to really poke the hornet's nest, you have to really prod and provoke them this much in order to get get the reaction you got, and get the rhetoric you got from the Israeli government. That tells me these are not, that Israel is not genocidal by nature at all, and that yet the left have been insisting for decades that it is. And it had to come to this for them to be able to clamour for a point to prove it. It's just flat on its face ridiculous to me.
Okay, let me give...
And you need to realise that.
Okay, let me give Mosab a chance to respond. I mean, the suggestion is that you are driven by personal enmity because of your family situation, with your father being one of the founders of Hamas, and you've since renounced that side of your life and that part of your family. What do you say to that charge that somehow you're driven by that more than anything else?
Right. Well, it is not only personal, it's fundamental. What I did during the Second Palestinian Intifada, I risked my life on a regular basis to save human lives from Hamas brutal suicide bombing attacks, because Hamas terrorism did not start on October 7. We're talking about waves of suicide bombing attacks that targeted civilians indiscriminately, where Jewish, Christian, Arabs, Muslims were killed during Hamas attacks. So our job was to stop Hamas from blowing up things. Buses, markets, beaches, beach houses, they targeted everywhere. Hamas' strategy of using civilians or targeting civilians is not a new thing. Now, for me to be sentenced to death for saving a human life because there is a belief system that says so, well, I totally reject that. And they want me to cease to exist. This is not a relationship between father and son. And by the way, I don't need your pity. My relationship with my father was an excellent relationship. I loved my father and he loved me. I'm sure he still does love me. But this is where we draw the line.
Now, if you've not really read Mosab's story, you might be surprised at that. You might have had a kind of preconception, as I did until I read his book, that if his father was Hamas, then it would seem to make sense that his father kind of groomed him into that hateful ideology. Then you would think, well, that his father must have been a really abusive, evil bastard. Then he must have been, he must have had an abusive father who just didn't care about him. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you actually read the book, it was the opposite. Basically described his father as actually a very charitable man. A very kind of conscientious, charitable man who followed the letter of Islam. And the thing is, he'd follow the dictates of Islam, of what it means to be a good Muslim is to be charitable, is to be respectful. There's kind of there's charity obligations in Islam, and he kind of adhered to that. And so growing up, he always saw that side, that side of his father as being charitable and placing charity first. He says the problem is, the deeper you get into Islam, the more the obligations go from the charitable stuff to the obligations to wage jihad against the enemies of Islam, which in this case, of course, is immediately the Jews in Israel, occupying Muslim lands, as they see it. And his father was, he did kind of notice the contradiction. His father was someone who didn't believe in hurting a fly at home, but when it came to the politics, when it came to the Hamas cause, he seemed to be willing to somehow excuse what Hamas was doing in terms of its suicide bombing. In fact, a lot of the time his father wasn't really at home. His father spent a lot of time in prison. And the resentment he felt towards Hamas was less because of his father, and more because of the way that when his father wasn't in the picture, he felt that the Hamas leadership just neglected their family and saw them as nothing, really. But that's basically what I mean, is that it wasn't this cliche thing of he had this abusive father or whatever. It was totally the opposite, but there you go.
When the higher interest of humanity is at risk, when people kill hundreds and thousands of civilians by the name of religion and by the name of ideology, somebody has to stand up. I am a son of that conflict, and I know exactly what's going on there, not only from the Palestinian point of view, but also from the Israeli point of view. Then you invite me to come join a revolution. What revolution you are talking about? You are just creating chaos. It's the revolution only for the sake of revolution. At some point, some 30 years ago, I believed, just like you. Today, I know a different truth. And I don't advocate on behalf of a revolution that does not have sight, that does not have any moral compass. That is a revolution only for the sake of revolution. So before you tell me about your revolution and about your protest, tell me about your objectives. What's your goal? What's your agenda? What's your agenda? Who is your leadership? The American parents have the right to be concerned when they see masked men on campuses. We don't know who the hell they are. They could be activists and they could be the devil. So parents have the right to say, we don't want masked men with foreign agendas on our campuses, because you don't have a leadership, and tomorrow, if the shit hit the fan, who is going to be held accountable for this situation? Who do we go after? Why your protest is not registered according to the American laws? You are just creating chaos, borrowing some victim narrative from the Middle East and trying to Americanize it, trying to globalize it. And what we say, as a person who lived the 1987 Intifada, we don't want Intifada in America, we don't want Intifada in the West, and we most certainly don't want a global Intifada.
Okay, Rama, before you speak in response to that, hang on, Rama.
What he's on about, two things. Now, the main thing he's getting across there, the talk about leadership is crucial because, there's all this demand by the left that there should be a recognised and free Palestinian state. The Palestinians deserve a state, they deserve sovereignty. And a recurring point with Mosab is, well, in order to get to sovereignty, that it is a decent and responsible leadership that earns you sovereignty. Decent, responsible leadership that, is willing to cooperate with its neighbours and be a good state, and build a good society. And so what he keeps on saying here is, what happens, how are we going to get to a kind of Palestinian state if we don't have a responsible Palestinian leadership? We don't even seem to have a unified leadership. We've got these various different terrorist factions who, if it wasn't for their mutual hatred of Israel, would be killing each other. So how can there be a Palestinian state? How can there be a sovereignty for the Palestinians? The other point he's making, of course, is he's saying that he's seen, the chance of, jihad and intifada, beginners just chants, beginners just some romantic idea of revolution, and then before you know it, it's people literally blowing themselves up and killing innocent civilians. He's seen just how quickly that just takes hold, and he's horrified to see that the same kind of chants, and to a degree the same kind of martyrdom complex take hold rapidly in the West. Like, we've even seen Aaron Bushnell and other figures in the pro-Palestine movement literally self-immolating, setting themselves on fire out of their rage and guilt over Palestine. So, to make this demonstration, it's this embrace of, self-sacrifice and martyrdom now. And this is in the West, this is just how radicalized and toxic the left are becoming. And there's anti-Semitic hate crimes as well. There's been a horrific case in Toronto where this scumbag gunman came to this Jewish girls' school with a gun and just started shooting, taking shots at the school kids there.
The premier called it a disgusting act of anti-Semitism. The bullets fired on the holiest day on the Jewish calendar.
It was the second shooting at the school. Police investigating whether the two are connected, saying keeping the community safe is their top priority. CTV's Mike Walker is live in North York with the story. Mike.
Well, Nathan, Michelle, police have charged a 20-year-old man and a 17-year-old boy in connection with the shooting incident at this Jewish school last week. And at this point, investigators are still trying to determine the motive.
A
large blue tarp still covers the windows of the Beishaya Mushka after shots were fired at the Jewish girls' school last weekend on the holiday of Yom Kippur. Investigators announcing today they have arrested 2 suspects, including a teenager.
While I can't share the details on the motivation behind this incident due to the ongoing investigation, we are thoroughly exploring why this incident occurred.
Investigators say the suspects fired shots at the school from a vehicle around 4 a.m. on October 12th. The Guns and Gang Unit taking the lead on the investigation with support from the Hate Crime Unit. Police say they seized a gun and yesterday arrested 20-year-old Helder Antonio de Almeida and a 17-year-old boy who cannot be identified under the Youth Criminal Justice Act.
It's the most horrific and evil thing I've ever seen in the West. And it's becoming kind of commonplace, and so I'm absolutely with them. I don't want that shit here. I don't want the shit that's happening in the Middle East to come here. It's horrifying that that's happening. And I think, to a degree, Ramazan's reaction, what do you want about it? There is an element of the generation gap here, that Ramazan is this young, passionate Palestinian activist, and Mosab is kind of jaded, disillusioned, and he does kind of see her with a certain degree of disdain as you're just this supercilious, naive young true believer. You don't have a clue. I've lived this. And, in some ways I think it's a shame he takes that stance, because he did actually say to her, quite crucially, I used to be you. I used to think the way you do. You are where I used to be, where you are now in terms of your activism for the Palestine and your hatred of Israel. You are where I used to be. I used to be a true believer of the Hamas cause and the liberation struggle and all that. I was a true believer of it, and I'm not anymore. And I would have kind of liked this debate to take the form of a kind of a meeting of kind of hearts and minds of, well, look, this is why I thought the way you did then, and this is why I don't now. This is why I have moved beyond that. This is why I don't think like you anymore. I would have liked that to be kind of been gone into. But it's as often the case with these debates. It's less a kind of people talk past each other. I think there was a lot of talking past each other on this, which I think was a shame, really.
I want to just, because last week you spoke at the University of Southern California at one of the protests, which were just referenced by Mosab there. I want to play a clip from what you were saying there. Let's just take a listen.
We are patient. We are patient. We are resilient. We are resilient. We are proud. We are proud.
So that was you addressing a crowd there. Nothing incendiary in what you were saying there, but we have seen many of these university protests, people openly talking about intifada, openly chanting from the river to the sea, others brazenly supporting Hamas. Can you understand why Jewish students at these campuses feel so threatened by this?
Really? Because when I was there, they were predominantly Jewish students who were protesting. There were predominantly Jewish students that were protesting. Even in the UCLA one, I don't know if I'm able to say his name, but one very prominent Jewish scholar was side by side with me in the protest in order to, because at the end of the day, we felt bad for these students because they're the ones facing police brutality. As Mr. Hassan said, they're the ones facing infiltrators who are attempting to discredit them. It was bizarre to see one student pose as a pro-Palestinian protester and then write inciting chants on the ground. And quickly, the pro-Palestinian students rushed to scrub it off. At the end of the day, though Mr. Hassan wants to make it into this political endeavor, again, this is older and this is bigger than Hamas, and it is much bigger than you, sir. What is happening now is these people, these students, are simply stating The slaughter of children is wrong. The siege is wrong. Abducting people for liking posts in other parts of Palestine is wrong. The harassment of women continuously is wrong. And the fact that we're having to even debate this is the most bizarre thing of the 21st century, because you're having this, because you'd hear about Vietnam or you'd hear about Iraq, but it wasn't so recorded as much as this genocide today.
But let me ask you this.
So,
let me ask you this.
Right. She is right in the sense that this is unprecedented, how recorded this has been, in terms of, that it's all over social media. The war footage of this is all over social media. Like Syria and Iraq, ISIS was the closest we came to this, where we saw some really graphic footage filmed by ISIS of them committing their killing sprees, their war crimes. They're just like the footage I saw from Iraq and Syria filmed by ISIS of them just killing Iraqis, shooting them dead. I was never the same after watching that. I honestly wasn't. It does mess with you in a big way, and it's the most evil thing I've ever seen in my life, frankly. The footage of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Now the thing is, she's talking about, it's recorded, but what's also recorded is what Hamas did on October the 7th. The fact that Hamas filmed what they did makes a huge difference, chiefly in that it's almost broadcasting an invitation to Israel's enemies. Look what we did, look how weak Israel were, look how Israel couldn't stop what we did. It's actually goading and encouraging more aggression against Israel, more hatred of Jews as a race. It's almost glorifying in genocide against Jews, and it's giving those who believe it, it's giving fellow anti-Semites a taste of a taste of blood, taste of Jewish blood. That's the most horrific thing, and to me it kind of compels Israel's response. It has to send a message of, you are not going to fucking get away with this. If you try this, this is what happens to you. This is what happens to your country. We're going to devastate you. The response has to be vengeful, to send the message that, we're not going to stand for this, and to deter anyone else who has ideas of pulling off what Hamas did. The fact it was filmed made the difference in a big way, and it meant that kind of put more of a demand on Israel to respond and send the message, never again.
How should Israel have responded to this terror attack on October the 7th? 1,200 people were massacred. And the people who perpetrated this, the Hamas terrorists, they were brazenly broadcasting a lot of their despicable acts of terror to the world. Proud of it. How should Israel, when presented with an existential threat like that, and when the Hamas spokesman responds a few days later by saying, we're going to do this again and again and again if we can, how should Israel have responded?
But Hamas leadership has also tried again and again and again to call for a truce and bring back the hostages, which has been denied from Netanyahu. That's also
hang on. I don't think Hamas should be given any credit for keeping hostages. They kidnapped Holocaust survivors. They kidnapped babies. They shouldn't have been kidnapping anybody. So they should be giving back the hostages anyway. But my point to you, which again you haven't answered yet, I'm curious what your answer is. How should Israel have responded
if you'd allow me to continue
to such a grotesque terror attack?
Both of you stop cutting me off. I will continue.
Well, just answer the question. I won't cut you off.
I would very much like to continue.
Yeah.
No, I will answer the question the way I see fit, the way I talk. You are not going to school me as to how to respond, sir. Now, to my point. 7th of October did not happen in a vacuum. Another bigger problem is that you've had lies being regurgitated by officials from the 7th of October. I urge everyone to check www.techforpalestine.com, which gives the truth and the proper research as to what unfolded on the 7th of October.
We don't need to read anything. Hang on, sorry. I'm sorry. Look, you can't revisit.
You do need to read.
Well, hang on.
You keep cutting me off. This is the most bizarre conversation ever.
I'm not cutting you off, Rama. I'm challenging you, as I will, by the way.
You are cutting me off. Let me. No, you can challenge me once I am done.
As I just said, Hamas broadcast what they were doing to the world. You don't need any report when you have people literally showing you on social media what you're doing and boasting about it.
This whole... I've done videos in which I've expressed, horror and outrage at the fact that the left, are spinning this conspiracy theories and about how October the 7th didn't really include mass rapes and this and that. It tends to downplay the horror of October the 7th, and even to spreading this conspiracy theory that that it was actually the Israeli military counterattacking the invading terrorists that caused a great deal of the collateral damage of Israeli civilians. That's a lie that's put up. That's the line that's put about. It's spun mainly by that scumbag parasite conman, grifter conman, Max Blumenthal, on the Grey Zone. He's an absolute scumbag and a money-grubbing grifter. He's a fucking poisonous snake. I hate him. Okay, but I have kind of forced myself to ask the question: why is it that the left chose, clinging on to this line about the denying that these rapes and that the savagery took place? I mean, do they really think anyone's going to be convinced that it would have been somehow out of character for Hamas to commit mass rapes and mass slaughter after we saw what ISIS did in Syria and Iraq? Does anyone, this idea that, how do the left expect people not to believe it when we know ISIS modus operandi was the same? Rape, genocide, slaughter, the most depraved methods of killing, the most sadistic methods of killing. And, as Brendan O'Neill has said, it's strange that so much of the progressive activist class, the feminists and, that always kind of emphasise believe all women and Me Too, who ordinarily would say that the worst thing you can possibly do when someone has been raped is to accuse them of lying, it's... the emphasis should be listen and believe, and yet suddenly that becomes forgotten when it comes to these, victims of, Jewish victims of rape by Hamas, who weren't just raped; they were often mutilated and murdered as well. I mean, apart from anything else, though, is that question of, well, why have they chosen? Why do they think this is a hill worth dying on, that Hamas aren't rapists? It was made up. I mean, because I did think to myself, well, from a progressive point of view, what would have been wrong with them saying, completely in character, completely, within their convictions, saying the rapes happened and they were horrific. What Hamas did to Jewish women was horrific and wrong. As a feminist, I condemn that. But as a feminist, I also don't see how the response to those rapes is to drop bombs on innocent women and children in Gaza who had nothing to do with the rapes that Hamas committed. That would be a perfectly respectable feminist stance to take. It would have been... And you would think that would win the maximum hearts and minds over. So why didn't they? What was this need to downplay how horrific October the 7th was? And I think I kind of came to a conclusion that whilst maybe that would be a viable stance of, the rapes were horrific, it's not a reason to go to war. It's not a reason to kill 40,000 civilians. That's disproportionate. That's collective punishment, this and that. But I think the point is that you could say that about any one horror that took place in October the 7th. the beheading of a Thai worker. That was the one that really stuck in my mind as the most horrific I'd seen. The gunning down of old age pensioners at a bus stop. That was one of the first images I saw from October the 7th. You could say, well, that was horrific, but it's no reason to wage this war. It doesn't have to come to war because of that. But I realised that October the 7th, it's that the collective horror of October the 7th, the accumulation of all these horrors, it was worse than the sum of its parts, if you know what I mean. And the fact that it was filmed as well as a brazen celebration of what they did, and a brazen message to the world of this is how vulnerable Israelis are, and this is us delighting in slaughtering them. This is almost, spreading the bloodlust, the taste for Jewish blood. That collectively, I think, made it imperative that there had to be war. So maybe the attempt to, the rape denialism is all some kind of desperate attempt to try and lessen the parts that make up that horrific whole, that compel there to have to be war.
It is very, something that I've realized through these debates is that it doesn't end up being a debate. It ends up being that I'm trying to convince you that Palestinian life is worth it.
But I agree.
Is as important.
You don't have to convince me at all.
It is quite
I completely agree.
That is, I don't...
Why are you trying to convince me that Palestinian lives matter?
I'm not... I don't even have a response to this. This is a very low conversation, sir.
You said you were trying to convince me that Palestinian lives are worth it. I said, of course they're worth it.
I'm not trying to convince you what... But you're not acting like it is. If you saw that, you wouldn't be bringing me back to the 7th of October.
Okay. The problem with war is that it necessitates it reduces human life to collateral, to enemy collateral. War is where the mores of civilized society and the restraint of diplomacy have failed. And so the only way to win the war is to be the nastier, ruthless side. Quite often. And being preoccupied with civilian collateral, just... There are obligations too, but it's at the end of the day, you're dealing with if you're dealing with an enemy that doesn't respect life, then you have to understand that you got to make calculated decisions about who lives or who dies in this war, who you're sending to die. But the objective is to protect your population from an aggressive threat that you can't be merciful with, because they're not going to be merciful with you, and they're not going to be merciful with your people. And it's a dereliction of duty to your people as a government if the people come to harm. In terms of the value of Palestinian life, I think something has to be admitted about the way I think a layperson views a life in the first world and life in the third world. Because I have kind of, I've known people kind of write about this as like, why is it that, I've known liberals kind of write, leftists write about this, say, but why is it that we empathise more with the victims of a terrorist attack in Paris than we do with the thousands of victims of the Syrian civil war, the Libya civil war, or the mass starving in Africa. And I think the thing is that we do view, people in the third world and the first world differently. We don't empathise the same way because their life, the life of people in the impoverished third world is so far removed from our own that it's like you can sympathise, but sometimes sympathising isn't the same thing as empathising, Sympathising is patronising, if you know what I mean. It's, oh, how awful. but it's not really being a willingness to put yourself in their shoes, and really putting yourself in their shoes is not a desirable mindset. No one really wants to dwell on that kind of life, because if you did, then you'd go crazy for the rest of your life if you did, I think. Life's too short to weep for the whole of humanity, frankly. And I think to a degree, when it comes to a murder, a tragic murder in America or Britain or France or Sweden, I think that kind of feels like it's horrifying, because it feels like a violation. It feels like, we live in the Western world, where, we've got the advanced medicine, advanced, greater security and peacetime. This should not be happening. This is a violation of everything. That means that victim should have been safe to live their life to the full, freely. Their life should never have been cut short like this. How can it be that happened? It kind of hits more of a note of outrage that it happened when it shouldn't have, and you do tend to think, their life, they had their whole life ahead of them, and it's because we know people, we know what a Western life looks like, we know what our own dreams and aspirations are, so we can empathise with theirs and think, and we can empathise with family, empathise with them as a victim who's died for no good reason, for no reason, seemingly. And the grieving family, we empathise with them. We can only imagine the horror, and often that's the thing, we do find ourselves imagining the horror. It hits a note of a note of violation of this shouldn't have happened here. Now, when it comes to the third world, when it comes to the Ethiopian famine, however, I think there is unfortunately a tendency to look at it as it's more of a collective tragedy. And when something's a collective tragedy, when the death toll being wider, sometimes it's harder to empathise with an individual victim of it. That gets harder. And also, I think when we understand that the third world is just a place where populations are more death prone, then it doesn't hit the same note of violation. I mean, maybe it should, because it's like Bob Geldof said, it's obscene that the people can die of want in a world of surplus. But we do tend to view it as a case of, look, if our charity work can get the death toll down from, let's say, from 50% to 40%, then that's an achievement in itself. We've kind of, we've turned things around just enough, and it's like, maybe that's as good as it gets. The 40% dying is inevitable. The deaths become a statistical inevitability in societies like that, and that's just the way it is. So we do tend to view death differently there. It becomes more of a case of, it's a tragic inevitability. There's not much we can do about it. If you get me. Now, I think what makes the Gaza situation unique in this is that, knowing that, there's an extra air of, the desire to give up completely for some, if, because, Gaza, I mean, there are parts of Gaza that were actually quite well off. There was a certain middle class elite in Gaza that were well off, but those in the below the poverty line were really below the poverty line. There was a lot of poverty in the Gaza Strip. So I think for most people there is the thought of, well, look, people who are kind of are less moved by the horrors in Gaza, or just kind of given up on being moved by the horrors in Gaza, it's generally because there is a thought of, well, look, if it's a statistical inevitability that as a third world nation you're going to have those kind of deaths happen anyway, then what the bloody hell is the leadership doing in starting an insane war that's going to get even more of their people killed? You know, it's like death is inevitable enough as it is for, you know, for that percentage of the population. Why have the leadership decided that just wasn't enough and decided to suddenly expand it and, you know, bring raining death on all of them by provoking Israel in this insane way? And so that does lend more to a sense of, you know, looking at the tragic victims of this war as just sadly a lost cause. It's like, well, they wouldn't be dying if they weren't ruled by Hamas, and they wouldn't be ruled by Hamas if they hadn't elected Hamas. And do they just not care about the well-being of their children when they elected Hamas? I mean, we can't parent their children for them as much as we want to. We can't wrap the world in cotton wool. You know, we can't wrap the world's children in cotton wool. That's the parents' job. But if the parents have decided to vote Hamas into power to propagate this endless, unwinnable war with Israel, then what can you do, really? You know, the question, you know, does Palestinian life matter? To a degree, that question has to be directed at Hamas more than anything, and to the Hamas's voter base. And it seems that the terrifying thing about Hamas is that they do not value life and death. They don't hold the same value of life and death as we do. That's the terrifying thing about them. And that makes it far harder for Israel to fight them.
But you're not acting like it is. If you saw that, you wouldn't be bringing me back to the 7th of October.
But that's what started this whole war.
About the 40,000 Palestinians who've been killed.
But October the 7th started this whole war.
Really?
Yes, it did.
That's not, again, this is, thank you for pointing out the exact issue that we have here. When you bring it to the point of that this started from the 7th of October, that is the problem.
This war started October 7th.
The issue of this
there was a ceasefire before that.
No, sir. No, sir.
Well, there was.
No, sir. I am very sorry to say that, that Palestinians living the way they were as second-class citizens on their land, even, and not just in West Bank.
That's a different question.
Or Gaza.
Israel and Palestine certainly existed in a de facto state of war ever since 1948. But what happened on October the 7th was pretty much the beginning of the end of any hope of a peaceful resolve. It was an insane escalation of the conflict at a time when, and it was the last thing either side needed, you would think. This insane kind of response. Now, the problem, of course, is that what was done on October the 7th was just deliberate targeting of civilians. I mean, it was so horrific that I do not care what took place before. Nothing can explain it beyond the fact that Hamas has spent 2 decades or longer even before even the Palestinian Authority, before they even kind of took power over the Palestinian Authority, they've had their unions running the UNRWA schools and brainwashing children, indoctrinating children with parental consent, with public consent, with popular public consent, brainwashing children to be jihadis who think it's their sacred duty in life to slaughter Jews. That's what I think led to October the 7th more than anything. Grievances of the occupation ended in 2005, but none of it could get me to understand October the 7th, the horrific slaughter that was done that day. That was just That was just evil. That was just demonic. It was just... The only thing that can explain that is the most horrific miseducation. The most depraved echo chamber of hatred of Jews, just disdain for life.
Point.
Rama, I agree with you.
Sir, you oppress a people, then let me finish. If you agree with me, what are you agreeing with?
I want you to answer my original question about how should Israel have responded to that terror attack. It's a straightforward question.
Because
what should they have done?
Your question, by ending the siege, by ending apartheid, by realizing that this is not a sustainable solution to keep oppressing a people.
Right, okay. Problem is, October the 7th vindicates why the siege and the checkpoints exist for a reason. October 7th vindicates why Israel has its checkpoints, to keep out security risks, security threats to the Israeli population. I mean, it's ironic that people who kind of, try to raise kind of, conspiracy theories about, why was Israel caught with its guard down that day? Why weren't they vigilant to the threat? And it's like, there must have been some conspiracy to let it happen or something. But what they don't seem to realise is that by saying that, they're actually admitting that there is a reason for Israel to maintain the paranoid and vigilant occupation it does. That it can't let its guard down. It has to maintain the walls. The walls of separation. It has to wall off the West Bank. It has to have these checkpoints. It has to, it's strange. It's like, they think they've kind of claimed a win by saying, well, how the hell did Israel not see this happening? Well, it's just like, yeah, but, that they did the very thing, if they did that, then they did the very thing you keep demanding that Israel does in terms of, lowering its guard, ending the siege, ending the apartheid walls, and ending the military presence in the Palestinian territories. So, yeah, you're kind of shooting your own case in the foot there.
I'll tell you something interesting. There is blatant attacks, like I blatantly kill you, but there is something that we don't realize that hurts sometimes even more, the intangible, the disrespect, the checkpoints. One day at one of these checkpoints, and the amount of disrespect these people have to go through.
I mean, Mosab has said elsewhere that for him, he remembered a time when there were far less checkpoints in the West Bank, and that actually there were times he actually did enjoy a lot more freedom of travel from the West Bank to Israel and back. And there was much more intermingling. And he said that the checkpoints tended to go up a lot more after various intifadas had been. There was the intifadas that led to the increase in checkpoints. It was also to a degree the deals with the Palestinian Authority for self-governance, where it was decided, well, we'll let the Palestinian Authority administer Area A deep in the Palestinian territories, but we want kind of some control over Area C surrounding it. So there has to be checkpoints if they're going to come from there to there, from Area A and B to C.
In the years before attempts were made to make a formal peace between Israel and the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, there was actually much more contact between the two sides. Many Arabs went and worked in Israel, brought back good wages, stimulated the economy. Personal relations between the two were much greater. Travel between the two was much greater. Almost unbelievably, there was a time when people from southern Israel used to go to Gaza for the nightlife. And in fact, the efforts to secure a formal peace have made all that much worse. So I steer away from them. I think if there is hope, then it will come in an informal agreement to live side by side.
The fact that at one point in the West Bank, a settler can just walk into your home, waltz into your home, destroy your home, take it, and be backed by a soldier. the utter disrespect of having so much injustice. There was this one Palestinian who said, our heart breaks every day over 100 times. What on earth? How is this sustainable? This is the longest siege on any place in history.
Okay.
I mean, what she's talking about, of course, is the main philosophy that, like, I think if we leave aside the really demonic anti-Semites on the left who just hate, you have this demonic view of Jews and Zionists and all that. If we leave them aside, what is the gist of the left's outrage at, Israel and the Israel-Palestine situation? Well, I mean, I think for most of them, and this is kind of the point, it comes down to the idea that there is no such thing as a benevolent occupation. There's no such thing as an acceptable occupation. There's no such thing as acceptable, there's no such thing as a benevolent dictatorship, because human nature dictates it, that power that can be abused is abused. And if you've got occupied territory, and if you're occupying their area, bad behavior, oppressive behavior is just inevitable. If people can oppress, they will oppress. And if people are oppressed, then they are powerless, and it always leads to horrific injustice. That kind of unacceptable power relationship always breeds injustice. That's just, the nature of the power and the powerless, the powerful and the powerless. The oppression isn't just going to end itself, and the fact that Israel has the power to do this it's a system ripe for abuse and ripe for lasting misery on the people who are helpless in the face of it. That's the angle, and that's the angle for why the occupation has to end. There's no such thing as a just occupation. The Palestinians deserve their sovereignty. Now, Mosab is kind of making the counterpoint, somewhat making a controversial counterpoint, that that sovereignty isn't just given. The occupation exists, as a placeholder for the fact that the Palestinians do not have a trustworthy leadership, and their society is rife with terrorist security threats. So how can they be trusted with statehood and sovereignty by the Israelis? And it's the idea that sovereignty isn't just given; it's earned.
What a two-state solution means is that Israel completely cedes sovereignty over the area, actually, of the West Bank and a large part of Jerusalem, and that would become a sovereign state next to Israel. Now, just imagine if that sovereign state, having been established, elected a Hamas government, and there was nothing between Israel, indeed the very heart of Israel, and its capital, except a fence or maybe a wall. And what we have seen on October the 7th would, I think, make that completely unsustainable as a long-term arrangement. My second reason, I've never accepted a two-state solution as being likely or possible. I don't think that there is, first of all, I don't think there's any will among the Arab leadership in the region to have a permanent settlement. I think there is a strong, deep, not necessarily publicly stated belief that Israel should not continue to exist, and such a state wouldn't have its own existence as its own end. And I also think that if you really want any kind of semblance of peace in the region, it has to be informal. If you attempt to have a detailed diplomatic solution, you'll never get there. The Israelis will never be prepared to concede enough, and the Arab side will never be prepared to put their name to such a thing. And also there was a very interesting point made by Yasser Arafat when he was still among us. He said, I don't want to be mayor of Jericho. As leader of the great world Palestinian movement, he was an international figure. As leader of a small, poor country in the Middle East without very much in the way of resources or armed forces, he would be a very minor figure. And you can see why that wouldn't appeal. I don't think it's workable, but on the other hand, I think there's a great deal of willingness to live and work together among the people of the region, which is often demonstrated when they're given the chance to do so. But I would steer miles away from trying to formalize it. And I'm always haunted by a conversation I had with an Arab-Israeli colleague from that very interesting group of people, the Arab Israelis, who are among the most thoughtful in the world for obvious reasons, as to who and where they are. And we were driving up through the north end of Israeli Jerusalem, trying to get into Ramallah in the Palestinian Authority area, which has now become quite a maze, and he knew the way. But as we wound round all these side roads and dodged roadblocks, he said, "Oh, for the good old days before we had peace."
Now, the problem, of course, is that what happened on October the 7th was a classic example of seeing... What I can't get past about October the 7th is that it was a day in which it actually was Hamas having power over the powerless. And being disturbed by the fact that the victims of October the 7th were helpless, they were powerless, they were just... the degrading way that they were treated, it's just... And these were innocent civilians, naive, innocent, young girls, young women, powerless at gunpoint, and you're kind of saying, well, look, they were helpless and powerless, and you even had that Thai worker who was just on the ground, beheaded with a shovel, half dead and then beheaded with a shovel. It's like you're telling me that these are people who are kind of... it's like, well, look, if you're outraged that, the powerful abusing their power, then why aren't you outraged about that? And, the fact that the left were willing to kind of skew how powerless they were, that there was no rape, so there was no, abuse of the powerful against the powerless and the helpless victims. That set alarm bells to me about the modern left in a big way. And it kind of, I think that was the point where I realised that, if I thought that maybe I could be on the left, on the same page as the left in terms of that view about the dynamic about the powerful and the powerless, that was the point where I realised, no, I'm not. I misjudged the left. Because, when it, and, a good number of them would seem to delight in the helplessness and powerlessness of the victims of October the 7th. They seem to delight in the slaughter, delight in bringing misery to privileged Israelis. It was the most shocking and disturbing and sick thing I've ever seen, frankly.
Let me ask Mosab
Of course you're going to have a 7th of October. Of course you're going to have resistance.
Yeah, actually,
At
nothing...
one point, the pressure point is going to
here's my problem.
Ramazan was talking there about resistance, the euphemism resistance, to describe what Hamas did. Or rather to put Hamas's actions under the umbrella of, Palestinian resistance in general. Now, what I think has always sat wrong with me, and it just seems baffling that it doesn't sit wronger with more people on the left, is that most people associate the idea of armed resistance with being a kind of, a desperate struggle, and the idea that, in an armed struggle, when it comes to the armed struggle, you've got to be kind of tactical, you've got to be efficient, you've got to move quickly, you've got to kind of, time is not on your side against a greater enemy, so you've got to be fast, efficient, aggressive. And to a degree, you've got to be ruthless, yes. But what's kind of striking about October the 7th is the fact that Hamas seemed to find the time to be gratuitous in its torture and slaughter, mutilation and rape of their victims. This was the actions of really sick, depraved serial killers, not a military operation, conducted within a desperate time window. It was just gratuitous sadism, blatantly so. And look, that sight of that half-dead Thai worker, being hacked away at by, on the ground, being hacked away at by Hamas members or just the Gazan citizenry, rather, who decided to join in the spoils and the killing spree, in the light of killing Jews. And just watching them behead him with a shovel, shouting Allah Akbar. There's nothing about that is at all kind of fits any conception of, the struggle for resistance. This is just sadistic savagery. This is just men, just kind of completely embracing their base instincts, their savage instincts. It's just the idea that this is resistance is just it should be laughable just on its face to say that that's somehow an act of resistance. I mean, they beheaded a Thai worker. It's like, if this was kind of some kind of left wing revolutionary uprising, you'd think that they would treat the Thai worker as a kind of as a class comrade rather than cut his head off. Apart from anything, it is the most disturbing sight in the October the 7th footage. And then, of course, there's the phone calls where you got one Hamas member phoning home and bragging, "I've killed 10 Jews. I killed this Jewish woman with her phone." It's like it's blatantly there that the motive for doing it was the glory of it was pure race hatred. This is not a resistance movement. This is just modern Nazis, worse than Nazis, in fact. The idea that this is resistance, that's a sickening joke, frankly. But anyway, it's a sickening joke.
I'm going to go to Mosab now, but here's my point about that. I would say that I agree with you. A lot of the settlements, particularly the expanded settlements in the last few months that we've seen, are completely outrageous and indefensible and should not be happening. I completely agree with you. But when you say that, of course, October 7th is going to happen, no, absolutely not. There is nothing to justify a terror attack on that scale.
Okay, the settlements. What is the grievance about the settlements? Why is this objected to so strongly? Now, why are they viewed as such a kind of a crucial injustice in the issue of the Israel-Palestine conflict? I'm going to read you a bit of Elan Journo's What Justice Demands. Now, but anyway, I'm going to read a portion of What Justice Demands by Elan Journo. The settlements. Inseparable from the occupation grievance is the issue of Israeli settlements. If you've ever heard about settlements at all, odds are that you heard them being vilified by Palestinian leaders, by United Nations agencies, by European governments, by the White House, as yet another way that Israel subverts Palestinian hopes for her homeland. The controversy over settlements is bewilderingly complex because it cuts across Israeli law, domestic policy and international diplomacy. Fully untangling it would require a whole other book. Instead, our aim is to understand the essentials of the issue and its moral significance. What matters here is how the settlements impact the lives and freedoms of particular individuals. What then are the settlements? Why are they regarded as inimical to Palestinians? How should we evaluate them? Settlements basically are existing and new neighbourhoods under Israeli jurisdiction but located on contested land. Nowadays that means principally in the West Bank and around the city of Jerusalem. There are some in the Golan Heights and there used to be some in the Gaza Strip until Israel withdrew in 2005, leaving behind every last one. From the way that the term settlements is invoked, you might expect it to refer to some uniform phenomenon. Not so. Some are urban neighbourhoods, some are villages, some are tiny outposts. A few are no more than a handful of shacks on a hillside, and whereas some are not only reasonable, legal and moral, others are immoral, illegal and subversive of the rule of law. So it's crucial to keep these distinctions in mind when thinking about the settlements. The suburban settlements began after the 1967 war. The Israeli government worked to fortify its security along the armistice lines. That entailed holding the conquered territories and encouraging their development with homes, schools, businesses, factories and military installations. A significant impetus was national security along areas of vulnerability. Another salient rationale was that it was a political goal of having Israelis populate more of the land. That goal was, and continues to be, controversial in Israel. Probably the most vocal group agitating for that goal are Jewish religionists, some of whom not only lobby for it, but also advance it illegally. More on that in a moment. Many people within Israel and in the international community oppose the settlements on the basis of international law, mainly the Fourth Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention. The doctrines of international law tell us, for example, that a country that gains territory in war cannot properly hold on to it, regardless of whether it was fighting in self-defense or initiated the war. So one kind of objection is that Israeli settlements flout provisions of international law. But the point is far from settled. One argument is that the Fourth Geneva Convention is inapplicable. Some hold that the doctrine might apply if, prior to 1967, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were internationally recognised as respectively Egyptian and Jordanian territory, but they were not. Egypt and Jordan had taken over these territories in 1948 following a military invasion. In other words, they had seized these lands as a result of initiating a war. Since then, neither Egypt nor Jordan had attained wide international recognition for their possession of those tracts of land. Another argument is that even if the Geneva Convention does apply to the territories, the settlements do not constitute a breach of its provisions, and there are still other arguments. The legal scholars Abraham Bell and Eugene Kontorovich have argued that a different international law doctrine could be invoked. It is known as uti possidetis juris, if it were applied. They write, it would entail recognising Israel's territorial sovereignty over all the disputed areas of Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza, except to the degree that Israel has voluntarily yielded sovereignty since its independence. If you delve into that debate, whichever view you find compelling, it's necessary to appreciate the limitation of arguments predicated on international law. The limitation stems from the fact that international law is fundamentally unlike English law or the US Constitution or Israel's basic laws or the laws of France. Instead, international law is based on the consent of sovereign nations that sign on to it. International law is at most customary. Practically, it's an opt-in arrangement, with some countries choosing to abide by some international norms some of the time. And unlike, say, American law, which the US courts and police enforce, there's no equivalent world agency that enforces international law. To call it law is an overstatement. Keep in mind, moreover, that even actual laws can be morally right. Example, laws prohibiting theft, or morally wrong. Example, government censorship of the media. Notice also that certain actions can be legal but morally wrong, like Jim Crow restrictions, while other actions can be morally right but illegal, like drinking alcohol during Prohibition. From these observations, there is a fundamental lesson to draw. The lesson is that even laws, and certainly conventional international laws, must be subject to moral judgment. Israel fought to defend its citizens from enemy forces that initiated war more than once. Given the geographical path that invading forces took in the past, the land Israel acquired is vital to its ongoing territorial security, so it is reasonable to put that land to use through cultivation and development, and on those grounds, Israel is well within its moral right to permit and encourage the productive use of these land in the form of building homes, schools and businesses. But there are three factors, at least, that greatly complicate this picture. One is Israeli land use policy. Two, the government's taking of private lands. And three, the campaign of certain religionists to establish unauthorized settlements. For many years, Israeli law enabled the state to take over private property and land under its control. That's similar to the US government's power of eminent domain to take property for public use. In 1950, in the aftermath of Israel's War of Independence, the government passed the absentee property law, which transferred to a government custodian abandoned real estate, fields, orchards, houses that had belonged to Muslims, Christians and others defined as Arabs. Land records were incomplete, which made it difficult for returning owners to reclaim their property. Applying laws akin to eminent domain, the Israeli government continued to take lands belonging to Arabs and transfer them to the administration of quasi-government organisations, the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency. The government's taking of property in these ways should be subject to legal scrutiny. In cases of unjust takings, the owners should be able to seek damages, if not also the restoration of their property. A second compounding factor is the fact that so much land fell under the administration of a government agency and allied non-profit organisations such as the Jewish Agency and the Jewish National Fund. This presents a host of difficulties. For example, between them, the government and these quasi-private, quasi-state organisations exerted control over most of the land in Israel, and these organisations followed a policy of allocating and selling land exclusively to Jewish people. This unjust practice was challenged in Israel's Supreme Court. An Arab couple with 2 children wanted to live in the settlement of Katzir, but their request was denied because they were Arabs. In a landmark ruling in 2000, the Supreme Court invoked the principle of equality under the rule of law, and it held that the state may not discriminate directly on the basis of religion or nationality in allocating state land. From this, it follows that the state is also not permitted to discriminate indirectly on the basis of religion or nationality in the allocation of land. Consequently, the state cannot enable such discrimination by transferring land to the Jewish agency. Adalah, an Israeli non-government organisation, estimates that as much as 93% of the land in the country remains under the control of the state and a non-profit organisation, the Jewish National Fund. Adalah has argued that JNF-owned land was being allocated through bids open only to Jews, and it mounted a legal challenge to this unjust practice. In 2005, Israel's Attorney General decided to disallow such discrimination in the marketing and allocation of JNF-owned land. The third compounding factor is the ongoing campaign of some Jewish religionists to proliferate settlements in disregard of property rights and the rule of law. When the occupation began, recall, Israel had pursued a policy of non-presence, hoping to administer the territories unobtrusively. But some religionists flouted that policy. They moved in to create unapproved, therefore illegal settlements. Once they squatted on land belonging to Palestinians Often they squatted on land belonging to Palestinians until the Israeli army showed up to evict them. They also lobbied the government to use its power to expropriate private land belonging to Palestinians for the purposes of building new Israeli neighbourhoods. Even though many Israelis repudiate that agenda, the religionist factions have found politicians who sympathise with, sometimes advisedly endorse their goal. This policy of expropriating Palestinian landowners is immoral because it's a clear violation of property rights, and it rightly met with considerable opposition. During the 1970s, Israeli courts heard several cases brought forward by Palestinians whose land was taken to create settlements. The turning point came in 1979. In the Elan Moreh case, the Israel Supreme Court decided in favour of the petitioners, the Palestinian landowners. From then on, the government was effectively prohibited from taking private land for use in settlements. The government decided, writes Shlomo Gazit, that future settlements would be built only on state and public lands, and it encouraged private buyers to purchase land surrounding an existing or planned settlement. Nevertheless, certain Jewish religionist factions regularly break the law in seeking to create illegal and immoral settlements. Typically, such unauthorised outposts pop up and then grow incrementally. A handful of zealots drag a mobile home to some patch of land, often land belonging to a nearby Palestinian family. Then they bring another mobile home and a few more people to establish a presence, sometimes putting up some shacks. Once situated, they demand police protection, though in reality, many of them have proven to be the real menace. Some of these messianic squatters beat up their Muslim or Christian neighbours, seeking to drive them off the land and out of business by vandalising olive trees and burning crops. They exhibit contempt for the rule of law. Of course, this phenomenon has no place in a free society. No proper government can allow one citizen to violate the rights of any other citizen. Like all criminal acts, the deeds of these religionists must be brought before the courts and punishment meted out to the guilty. The landowners are entitled to the state's protection of their lives and property. They deserve compensation for any property damage and any land stolen from them. A worrying sign. A new law is making its way through the Israeli parliament that would recognise certain unauthorised outposts and in effect reverse the prohibition on the taking of private land. By the way, this book was written in 2018, so bear that in mind, how recent the law might have been. The Israeli government, it should be noted, has often worked to dismantle such outposts, forcibly removing squatters and demolishing their makeshift homes. But part of what keeps the phenomenon going is that activists collude with sympathetic officials in regional councils and within various ministries. The scale of the problem, going by the number of illegal outposts, may be small, but it cannot be permitted to continue. Let us sum up our discussion of the intertwined grievances about the occupation and settlements. First, when we consider the years from 1967 through the early 1990s, when Israel began ceding some of the territory to the Palestinian Authority, we see that residents of the occupied territories in general saw their standard of living greatly improve. Second, Israeli errors in failing to make the territories non-threatening and Israeli moral breaches in its land use policy and the taking of private property are real, and they're important for understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Third, we've seen cases wherein some Palestinians have current legitimate grievances about Israeli government policy and practices. Without excusing any of these wrongs or injustices, we've also seen that it is only under Israel's legal and political system, notably its Supreme Court, that Palestinians and advocacy groups working on their behalf have the chance of eventually getting justice through the law. If they lived in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, or elsewhere in the Middle East, and some comparable wrong was done to them, they would have no reason to expect justice in the courts. And worse, by speaking up against their government's policies, they risk having the government inflict further injustices against them. When looking at Israeli errors and moral failings here, one crucial point comes through. Even the most serious of the grievances pertaining to the occupation, settlement and land use cannot explain the view advocated by leaders of the Palestinian movement, its patrons, state sponsors and supporters, that the Israeli government per se is illegitimate and that the state of Israel must be scrubbed from the map. The disparity between the wrongs and the putative remedy is so vast, so incommensurate, that it points to an ulterior pre-existing motivation, and it is particularly revealing that the fundamental hostility toward Israel long predated the occupation, and it actually became more ferocious when Israel began ceding control of some of the occupied territories, as we'll see in the next chapter, which I'm not going to bother with. Right, the crucial thing about what justice demands is that it has a very gushing view of Israel as the one democracy in the Middle East, the one secular democracy in the Middle East, and it's very much framed as the binary of the America is great because it's a secular democracy. Israel is a noble ally because it's a secular democracy. And we both share the same enemy in theocratic regimes like Iran and theocratic terror groups like jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas. We all share the same cause and we share the same enemy. Now, so I think what kind of gets across in that reading is that Elan Journo is very much a fan of secular Israel, democratic Israel. He's not so much a fan of Zionist Israel. He's not, or certainly not a fan of ultra-Zionist Israel. Let's be kind of specific about this. So, when it comes to really ultra-religious, the religionists in power, that's where he says, that's not the Israel I'm behind. Israel should put secular law above religion. And the injustice is that there are religionists with great power who put their religion above the law. So that's worth bearing in mind. So what does Mosab say about these settlements?
We go to Mosab. Mosab, let me ask you about that issue of the settlements. What is your view about expanding settlements in the way that Israel's been doing? Because it seems to me that they are crossing a line when they do that, which is completely indefensible.
Well, speaking of settlements, or what so-called settlements, those are cities of hundreds of thousands of people. This was the result of the 1967 war, when the Arab countries united wanted to annihilate the state of Israel. Arabs had their opportunity back in 1948 to declare their independence. They had equal opportunity like the Jewish people.
What is he talking about? Well, there's a thread by a tweeter called Liquid Fairy, who's done a thread on the issue of settlements. Liquid Fairy says, let's talk about Yishuv Keilati, which is a type of town or village in Israel and in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. They are referred to by Western media as settlements, which is actually an incorrect translation of the words. For the sake of this article, I will use the Western terminology so as not to confuse. However, be on notice that it is not the correct term. I have addressed the term West Bank in the thread. A thread. Myth. Israeli settlements are legal. Fact. On November 18, 2019, Secretary of State Michael Pompeo expressed the Trump administration's position that the establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not per se inconsistent with international law. The media inaccurately described this as a reversal of long-standing American policy. In truth, the record is more complicated. Jews have lived in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, since ancient times. They were prohibited from living in the territories only during Jordan's occupation from 1948 to 1967. Jews began to settle in the area again after it was captured by Israeli forces in the defensive war fought in 1967. The idea that these Jewish communities are legal derives primarily from UN resolutions of the International Court of Justice, an arm of the UN. The UN does not make legal determinations, only political ones, tainted by the overwhelming anti-Israel majority. The ICJ does not have jurisdiction over all disputes between UN member states, according to the Congressional Research Service. In fact, with the exception of advisory opinions which are non-binding, the ICJ may only resolve legal disputes between nations that voluntarily agree to its jurisdiction. Opinions of the ICJ are routinely ignored by the countries they are directed at, and the Europeans would never accept the idea that they trump the decisions of their judiciaries. Likewise, the United States, Russia and China never signed the treaty establishing the court and do not accept its jurisdiction. Israel does not recognise the court's jurisdiction on the settlement issue. Like other democracies, Israel has an independent judiciary. As Pompeo noted, its Supreme Court has confirmed the legality of certain settlement activities and has concluded that others cannot be legally sustained. Legal scholars dispute the ICJ opinion that the settlements violate international law. Stephen Schwebel, formerly president of the ICJ, notes that a country acting in self-defense may seize and occupy territory when necessary to protect itself. Schwebel also observed that a state may require security measures to ensure its citizens are not menaced again from that territory as a condition for its withdrawal. Furthermore, UN Security Council Resolution 242 gives Israel the legal right to be in the West Bank. According to Eugene Rostow, a former Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs in the Johnson administration, Israel is entitled to administer the territories it acquired in 1967 until a just and lasting peace in the Middle East is achieved. The United States has not regarded Israeli settlements as illegal. The oft-cited exception is the opinion of State Department legal advisor Herbert Hansel in the Carter administration. He argued that establishing settlements in the occupied territories, which included the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, is inconsistent with international law. This conformed to the views of President Carter at the time, who was critical of the Israeli settlement policy. Legal scholar Eugene Kontorovich noted, however, that Hansel said the state of occupation would end if Israel entered into a peace treaty with Jordan, which it did in 1994. Nevertheless, the State Department never updated the memo. Ronald Reagan rejected Hansel's opinion of settlements. On February 3, 1981, he said, "I disagreed when the previous administration referred to them as illegal. They're not illegal." Secretary of State James Baker was asked if the Bush administration regarded the settlement as illegal, and his answer was, "This is not our policy." The Obama policy has also been mischaracterized. Secretary of State John Kerry and President Barack Obama were very critical of Israel's settlement policy, but Kerry did not call them illegal. He said they were illegitimate. His only statement regarding their illegality was when he mentioned settler outposts that are illegal under Israel's own laws. Obama abstained rather than vetoed the UN Security Council resolution labelling settlements as illegal, which was generally interpreted as an endorsement of that view. However, it did not affect US policy since he left office shortly thereafter. In response to criticism that the Trump administration's decision on the legality of settlements would harm the peace process, which at the time was moribund, Pompeo said the Carter formulation hadn't advanced the cause of peace. By making explicit that the settlements are not illegal, the United States sent a message to the Palestinians and their supporters that their misinterpretation of international law cannot be used to coerce Israel to capitulate to their demands. A change in Israel's settlement policy will only come if that is the will of the Israeli people and advances the peace process. Myth. Settlements are an obstacle to peace. Fact. Settlements have never been an obstacle to peace. From 1949 to 1967, when Jews were forbidden to live on the West Bank, Arab leaders refused to make peace with Israel. From 1967 to 1977, the Labour Party established only a few strategic settlements, yet Arab leaders were unwilling to agree to peace with Israel. The fact that a Likud government committed to greater settlement activity took power in 1977. The fact that a Likud government committed to greater settlement activity took power in 1977 did not stop Egypt from signing a peace treaty with Israel or Prime Minister Menachem Begin from removing the Jewish settlements in the Sinai. Israel froze settlement building for 3 months in 1978, hoping the gesture would entice other Arabs to join the Arab Camp David peace process, but none did. In 1994, Jordan signed a peace agreement with Israel and settlements were not an issue. Between June 1992 and June 1996, under Labour Party-led governments, the Jewish population in the territories grew by approximately 50%. This rapid growth did not prevent the Palestinians from signing the Oslo Accords in September 1993 or the Oslo II Agreement in September 1995. Those agreements left the question of settlements for final status negotiations did not put any restriction on them in the interim. In 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered to dismantle dozens of settlements, but the Palestinians still would not agree to end the conflict. In 2005, Israel evacuated all Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip and 4 in northern Samaria, but terror attacks continued. In 2008, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert offered to withdraw from approximately 94% of the West Bank, but the deal was rejected. In 2010, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu froze settlement construction for 10 months, and the Palestinians refused to negotiate until the period was nearly over. After agreeing to talk, they walked out when Netanyahu ended the freeze and had still not returned to negotiations by August 2022. The settlements do not displace Arabs living in the territories. The media sometimes give the impression that several hundred Palestinians are forced to leave for every Jew who moves to the West Bank. The truth is that most settlements have been built in uninhabited areas, and even the handful established in or near Arab towns did not force any Palestinians to leave. Contrary to the Palestinian-inspired hysteria about settlement expansion, only 5 settlements were built in the 1990s. In 2017, work began on the first new settlement in 20 years. Settlement activity may stimulate peace because it forces the Palestinians to reconsider the view that time is on their side. The Palestinians now realise, said Bethlehem Mayor Elias Frey, that time is now on the side of Israel, which can build settlements and create facts, and that the only way out of this dilemma is face-to-face negotiations. Many Israelis question the wisdom of expanding settlements. Some consider them provocative, others worry that the settlers are particularly vulnerable and note they have been targets of repeated terrorist attacks. To defend them, many soldiers are deployed who would otherwise be training and preparing for a potential future war. Some Israelis also object to the money that goes into these communities and special subsidies provided to make housing more affordable. Still others feel the settlers are providing the first line of defence and developing land that rightfully belongs to Israel. The disposition of settlements is a matter for negotiations. The question of where the final borders will be between Israel and a Palestinian entity will likely be influenced by the distribution of these Jewish towns in Judea and Samaria. The border with Gaza was unofficially defined following Israel's withdrawal. Israel wants to incorporate as many Jews as possible within its borders, while the Palestinians want to expel all Jews from any territory they control. Izoic. If Israel withdraws unilaterally or as part of a political settlement, many settlers will face expulsion from their homes or voluntary resettlement in Israel with financial compensation. The impediment to peace is not the existence of Jewish communities in the disputed territories, but the Palestinians' unwillingness to coexist with Israel instead of replacing it. In the meantime, despite their complaints, thousands of Palestinians work in settlements. Settlement growth over time. Myth. Settlements violate the Geneva Convention. Fact. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the forcible transfer of people of one state to the territory of another state that it had occupied due to war. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the forcible transfer of people of one state to the territory of another state that it had occupied due to war. The convention was never meant to apply to a case like the settlements. Morris Abraham, one of its drafters, said that they were concerned with the types of crimes committed by the Nazis, such as the forcible eviction of Jews for purposes of mass extermination. This is in no way relevant to the settlement issue. Jews are not being forced to go to the West Bank. On the contrary, they are voluntarily moving back to places where they or their ancestors once lived before being expelled by others. The International Court of Justice's opinion about the illegality of settlements was based on a fallacious interpretation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The ICJ presupposes that Israel is now occupying the land of a sovereign country. However, as former Israeli ambassador to the UN Dor Gold notes, there was no recognised sovereignty over the West Bank prior to Israel's entry into the area. Jordan had previously occupied the area. A country cannot occupy territory to which it has sovereign title. Hence, the correct term for the area is disputed territory, which does not confer greater rights to the Israel or the Palestinians. Confer greater rights to Israel or to the Palestinians. The Palestinians never had sovereignty in the West Bank, whereas the Jews did for hundreds of years. The Jewish right of settlement in the area is equivalent in every way to the right of the local population to live there, according to Professor Eugene Rostow, the former Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs. Legal scholar Eugene Kontrovich argues that Israel has the strongest claim to the land because international law holds that a new country inherits the borders of the prior Jew political unit in that territory. Israel was preceded by the League of Nations Mandate for Palestine, whose borders included the West Bank. Adam Baker, a former legal advisor to Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, adds that the Oslo Accords instituted an agreed legal regime that overrides any other legal framework, including the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. The effort to apply the convention to Israel reflects a clear double standard. Kontorovich notes that the significant migration of settlers into an occupied territory under the auspices of the occupying power is a ubiquitous feature of a prolonged territorial control. He adds that no one has ever been prosecuted for violating the convention except for a few sentences in an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice. Its interpretation has been confined to academic and political statements entirely within the particular context of Israel. Myth. Israel must dismantle all the settlements for peace. Fact. When serious negotiations begin over the final status of the West Bank, battle lines will be drawn over which settlements could be incorporated into Israel and which must be evacuated. In August 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon acknowledged that not all the settlements of today in Judea and Samaria will remain, while leaked Palestinian negotiating documents indicate the Palestinians were prepared to accept that some settlements would be incorporated into Israel. In Gaza, Israel intended to withdraw completely. No settlements were viewed as vital to Israel for economic, security or demographic reasons. The situation in the West Bank is completely different because Jews have strong historical and religious connections to the area stretching back for centuries. Moreover, the West Bank is an area with strategic significance because of its proximity to Israel's heartland, and roughly 1/4 of Israel's water resources are located there. The disengagement from Gaza involved only 21 settlements and approximately 8,500 Jews. Today, nearly 500,000 Jews live in 128 communities on the West Bank. More than 40% of these settlements have fewer than 1,000 citizens, 23% have fewer than 500, and only 13% have more than 5,000. Approximately 71% of the Jews in the West Bank live in 5 settlement blocks, 4 of which are near the 1949 Armistice Line, the Green Line. It is incorrect to refer to a 1967 border. Another 330,000 live across Green Line in East Jerusalem. There are large communities with thousands of residents. Evacuating them would be the equivalent of dismantling major American cities such as Annapolis, Maryland, Olympia, Washington, or Carson City, Nevada. Ma'ale Adumim is not a recently constructed outpost on a hilltop. It is a 46-year-old suburb of Israel's capital, barely 3 miles, 5 kilometers outside Jerusalem's city limits. That is popular because it is clean, safe, and close to where many residents work. It is also the 3rd largest Jewish city in the territories, with a population of more than 40,000. Approximately 10,000 people live in surrounding settlements included in the Ma'ale block. The Gush Etzion block consists of 13 communities with a population of roughly 40,000, just 10 minutes from Jerusalem. Jews lived in this area before 1948, but the Jordanian Legion destroyed the settlements and killed 240 women and children during the 1948 war. After Israel recaptured the area in 1967, descendants of those early settlers re-established the community. The city of Bet Al-Ilit, with nearly 70,000 residents, is part of this block. The Givat Zeev block includes 5 communities just northwest of Jerusalem. Givat Zeev, with a population of more than 20,000, is the largest. Modin Ilit is a block with 4 communities. The city of Modin Ilit is the largest in all the disputed territories, with more than 83,000 people, situated just over the Green Line, about 23 miles northwest of Jerusalem, and the same distance east of Tel Aviv. Ariel, with a population of more than 20,000, is now the heart of the second most populous block of settlements. The city is just 25 miles, 40 kilometers east of Tel Aviv, and 31 miles, 50 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Ariel and the surrounding communities expanded Israel's narrow waist, which was just 9 miles or 15 kilometers wide before 1967, and ensures that Israel has a land route to the Jordan Valley in case Israel needs to fight a land war to the east. It is more controversial than the other consensus settlements because it is the furthest from the Green Line, extending approximately 12 miles, 19 kilometers, into the West Bank. Nevertheless, Ariel is expected to be annexed to Israel if a peace agreement is reached. Most peace plans envision Israel annexing sufficient territory, 4 to 6%, to incorporate 75 to 80% of the Jews in the West Bank. In exchange, the Palestinian entity would get the same amount of land from Israeli territory, possibly in the Negev adjacent to the Gaza Strip. Based on the figures in the table above, only 71% of the settlers would be within Israel's borders if these 5 blocks were annexed. Roughly 1/3 of the remaining Jews are expected to move into Israeli territory, bringing the total to 80%. Israel would still have to evacuate approximately 100,000 people. This would involve another gut-wrenching decision that many settlers and their supporters will oppose with even greater ferocity than the Gaza disengagement. It is hard to imagine any Israeli government agreeing to such a mass transfer of its citizens. Myth. Israel plans to annex all the settlements. Fact. Israel could have annexed the entire West Bank or the settlements at any time since 1967, but has not done so. It is still a possibility, but those are just 2 options that have been discussed for the disposition of the West Bank. Others include Israel unilaterally delineates its border and determines which settlements it will annex. Israel establishes its border along the route of the security fence, incorporating the settlers on its side within Israel and forcing those on the other side to move inside the border. Israel annexes the settlement blocks. Israel annexes the settlements in the Jordan Valley. Israel annexes the settlements in the Jordan Valley and the blocks. Israel negotiates a peace treaty with the Palestinians that specifies which Jewish communities will remain intact within the mutually agreed border of Israel and which, if any, will be evacuated. In 2020, the Netanyahu government considered applying Israeli sovereignty to some or all of the settlements, but decided not to as a condition for the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. Myth. Settlements preclude the creation of a contiguous Palestinian state. Fact. As the map attached indicates, it is possible to create a contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank even if Israel incorporates the major settlement blocks. The total area of these communities is less than 2% of the West Bank. A kidney-shaped state linked to the Gaza Strip by a secure passage would be contiguous. Some argue that the E1 project linking Mali Adumim to Jerusalem would cut off East Jerusalem, but that is not necessarily true, as Israel had proposed constructing a 4-lane underpass to guarantee free passage between the West Bank and the Arab sections of Jerusalem. The map also illustrates that Israel would have its contiguity interrupted by the passageway between Gaza and the West Bank. Myth. There are no Palestinian settlements. Fact. Whenever Israel announces plans to build in the West Bank, an international furor erupts with false claims about their illegality. Meanwhile, the world was silent when the Palestinian Authority announced plans to violate the Oslo Accords unilaterally by cancelling the West Bank's division into Area A, B and C, and treating the entire area as sovereign Palestinian territory. Even before that announcement, the Palestinians built settlements in Area C, where Israel must approve any construction. Illegal settlements and infrastructure have spread across 250 Area C locations, occupying more than 2,000 acres. The PA has offered incentives such as tax exemptions, discounts for vehicle registration, and jobs for those who settle in Area C. While Israel is pilloried any time it suggests moving Bedouins from their encampments to another location or permanent housing, nothing is said about the PA's efforts to do the same. European countries which routinely criticise Israeli settlements provide funding for constructing the illegal Palestinian settlements. European countries, individually and through the European Union, have pumped hundreds of millions of euros annually into scores of illegal state buildings and related projects called Area C interventions, according to investigative journalist Edwin Black. People who would ordinarily be concerned about water and other environmental issues have ignored the Palestinian building projects, which Black notes are not natural Arab urban growth or urban sprawl. He says they are meant to carve up Area C, sometimes surround Jewish villages, and sometimes push onto Israeli nature or military reserves. Palestinians have complained about the slow process of obtaining building permits from the civil administration and the high rejection rate. Black related that the number of applications has dropped because the Palestinians deny Israel's right to issue them and just start building. The courts hamstring Israel's efforts to stop the illegal construction. Despite lacking citizenship, Palestinians can petition Israeli courts, including the Supreme Court, and do so with the help of well-funded NGOs. A military spokesman told Black it could take years to decide. Meanwhile, they are still building. We can't do anything about it. If the court ultimately rules in Israel's favour, the government is denounced by critics for demolishing the illegal structures. Another troubling aspect of the Europeans' funding is their reluctance to look carefully at the organisations they are funding to build up Area C, which include supporters of the anti-Semitic BDS movement with connections to terror organisations. Black reports, for example, that European governments have funded the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, which is linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Consider the impact on the peace process of the European-backed activities by the PA. By building settlements, the Palestinians are trying to prevent Israel from creating a contiguous area for its future borders, precisely what Israel's critics accuse it of doing. The Palestinians often complain that a future state would look like Swiss cheese because of the geographic distribution of Jewish communities, but they are creating the holes themselves by establishing isolated settlements separated from the main population centres and nearer Jewish towns. Moreover, by claiming sovereignty in Area C, the Palestinians have violated the Oslo Accords, further undermining Israeli confidence that they can be trusted to honour the terms of any future agreement. New towns established by the Palestinians in the West Bank should be referred to as settlements and condemned with the same ferocity as critics of Israeli construction for creating facts on the ground. The West Bank is disputed territory. The Palestinians have no sovereign rights there today, nor have they had any in the past, which would justify their incursion into Israeli-controlled territory. Those who constantly bemoan the disappearing two-state solution and unilateral action should be outraged by the Palestinian campaign of creeping annexation and brazen efforts to predetermine the borders of any possible state by their illegal construction in areas that Israelis have an equal right to claim as their own. Myth. The E1 project threatens the establishment of a contiguous Palestinian state. Fact. Initially formulated by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin just months before his assassination, the E1 plan is to populate the roughly 4.6 square mile valley, the 12 square kilometres valley between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, which Palestinians agree will be part of Israel in any future agreement. The settlement of some 50,000 people is essentially a suburb just 3 miles, 5 kilometres outside the capital. The E1 project envisions the construction of 3 residential neighbourhoods and a commercial industrial zone. Critics claim the E1 project would cut off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank and doom a two-state solution. In one case, they began to openly support the illegal Bedouin encampment of Khan al-Amar, including by moving the residents from tents to new structures and building a school for all the Bedouins in the vicinity. The site is located near E1 to block Israel's plans for the area. Israel's Supreme Court approved the demolition of the illegal structures and the relocation of the Bedouins. However, international protests in the Israeli elections in 2019 delayed implementing the decision. Still undecided, the government asked for more time to formulate a position in March 2022 and still had not taken any action by August. Anyway, so as you gather, it is a bit more complicated than is often made out.
This was the result of the 1967 war, when the Arab countries united wanted to annihilate the State of Israel. Arabs had their opportunity back in 1948 to declare their independence. They had equal opportunity like the Jewish people. The Jewish people fought the British colonialism, and they shed blood, and eventually they earned their independence. But in 1948, instead of the Arabs declaring their independence, they declared war against the Jewish people.
Now, I'm going to read a bit from Elan Journo's book, What Justice Demands, on what he's talking about when he talks about the rejection of the peace deal. Let's see, what is it? Okay then. The run-up to the war. Okay. When the Ottoman Empire crumbled in the wake of World War I, the British moved into the region and assumed control over Palestine. The British governed Palestine under an arrangement defined by the League of Nations, a predecessor of the United Nations, called a mandate. Formulated in 1922 and enforced until 1948, the British mandate was created to pave the way for the establishment of a Jewish national home and the safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. In the decades following World War I, the number of Zionist immigrants grew considerably, particularly so with the rise of Nazism and the outbreak of World War II. These newcomers had a profound impact. Electrical power plants began operating. New medical clinics and hospitals were built. Training centres for doctors and nurses opened up. The ensuing financial investments in factories and businesses, the importation of scientific farming techniques, and the avid purchase of land by Zionists resulted in a climbing standard of living. The effects were manifest throughout society. Economically, many people who were once peasant farmers gravitated to major cities in search of employment and the related benefits of city life. Between 1930 to 1939, the Muslim and Christian population of the port city of Haifa increased by 87%. Overall, the Muslim and Christian population, according to a British government report, saw massive growth, a growth of over 50% in 17 years. What were key factors behind that population spike? The newly available health services, the combating of malaria, the reduction in the infant death rate, the improvement of the water supply and public sanitation, all carried out by the incoming Zionists. Wages earned at Zionist farms and factories and the profits from land sales spurred the development of what British officialdom called Arab industrial undertakings, from soap and flour to bricks and bedsteads to alcohol and clothes, which nearly doubled between 1914 to 1933. Such developments fueled progress and prosperity. But from these advances, some people recoiled. The presence of outsiders with their foreign ways, the reshaping of traditional society and customs, the acceleration of economic productivity on farms and in factories, the growth of industry and development of city life. Witnessing all of that, some inhabitants opposed continued immigration and land purchases. The historians Baruch Kimmerling and Joel Migdal report that for some people, the opposition to outsiders tended to focus on the port towns seen as an insidious representation of the dislocation brought by the West, and on the open embrace of European manners and dress, and on an all too eager acceptance of byproducts of the Enlightenment and the Western scientific revolution. Such opposition depicted outsiders as a corrupting force. Listen to the diatribe of one villager. Money is God in Tel Aviv. Must all Palestine become one day like this, including the holy city of Jerusalem? Tel Aviv is an ulcer eating into our own country. If it is what the Jews want to make of Palestine, I wish my children dead. We do not mind poverty, but we weep when our peace is taken away. We lived a modest and contented life, but what shall we do if our children grow up to ape the noisy ways of these new people? Stoking these anti-Western sentiments was Haj Amin al-Husseini, who held the post of Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, kind of religious community leader and representative. The Mufti articulated that viewpoint even more forcefully. He railed against the invasion of liberal ideas. Speaking in 1935, he explained, "The cinema, the theatre, and some shameless magazines enter our houses and courtyards like adders where they kill morality and demolish the moral foundations of society." He also complained that the Jews have spread their customs and usages which are opposed to our religion and to our whole way of life. Voicing a sentiment that would surely elicit nods of approval from the Taliban, the Ayatollahs of Iran, the clerics of Saudi Arabia, and the leaders of ISIS, the Mufti claimed that the Jewish girls who run around in shorts demoralise our youth by their mere presence. Hammering on these themes, the Mufti was integral to the riots and armed uprising that raged between 1936 to 1939. But soon this ferocious uprising became primarily directed against the Mufti's Arab rivals and ordinary Palestinian Arabs. The historian Howard Thacker now observes that the Mufti's offensive grew in scope and momentum till by the end of 1939 his victims exceeded 3,000. Egypt and Lebanon were crowded with nearly 18,000 fugitives of the terror. But all of this was in the name of what? A salient, if not the principal factor in the Mufti's campaign appeared to be his lust for political domination. Here we can see two crucial and related things that shaped the 1948 war and that to this day continue to fuel hostility. Notice first how so much of the hostility toward the immigrants and the nascent Israel stemmed from a religious imperative. The Islamic self-image entails membership in a worldwide community of believers, the Ummah. Members of that vast collective in turn have a duty to show solidarity with their co-religionists against outsiders. That collective religious imperative, present in 1936 to 1939, would move slightly to the background until the mid-1980s, but as we'll later discuss, it has surged to prominence again. Second, in the uprising of 1936 to 1939, we can see foreshadowed a key feature of the 1948 war that erupted when Israel declared its independence, the war that led to the refugee problem. A major, if not the overriding motivation behind the aggression in both cases was a desire for conquest and subjugation. Just as the Mufti attempted to seize power in the 1930s, so the invading Arab armies in 1948 hoped to enlarge their dominions. And this is basically what he's getting at.
The Jewish people fought the British colonialism, and they shed blood, and eventually they earned their independence. But in 1948, instead of the Arabs declaring their independence, they declared war against the Jewish people. There was no such Palestine at that time. They were just Arabs. And in the British era of colonialism, Jews, Arabs, Druze, Christians, everybody in that area was called a Palestinian. The Palestinian is a colonial entity. It was not a country and it was not a nationality. It was just a 25-year period. So now, when we convinced ourselves that we were Palestinians because of Yasser Arafat wanted us to be Palestinians, the chaos had begun.